The Syrian conflict did not erupt overnight. Decades of political and economic grievances under the Assad family rule set the stage. Hafez al-Assad ruled with an iron fist, suppressing dissent. Basic freedoms were curtailed, creating an environment of fear. Economic disparities and corruption fueled discontent. By the time Bashar al-Assad took power, hopes for reform were dashed. These grievances eventually boiled over, fueled by the Arab Spring. The year 2011 witnessed an unprecedented wave of popular uprisings across the Arab world, a phenomenon that came to be known as the Arab Spring. From Tunisia to Egypt, people took to the streets, demanding an end to autocratic rule, corruption, and economic inequality. This wave of change, fueled by social media and a yearning for freedom, would soon reach Syria's doorstep. In March 2011, inspired by the events unfolding in neighboring countries, a group of teenagers in the southern city of Daraa, Syria, spray-painted anti-government graffiti on a school wall. Their act of defiance, seemingly insignificant at first, would spark a nationwide uprising. The teenagers were arrested and allegedly tortured by security forces, igniting protests in Daraa demanding their release. These protests, initially focused on local grievances, quickly spread to other parts of the country, morphing into a broader call for political reform and an end to the Assad regime. Protesters chanted for freedom, democracy, and an end to corruption, echoing the demands of their counterparts across the Arab world. The Syrian government's response was swift and brutal. Faced with growing unrest, the Syrian government, led by Bashar al-Assad, resorted to a brutal crackdown on protesters. Security forces opened fire on peaceful demonstrations, killing and injuring hundreds. Arbitrary detentions and torture became commonplace as the regime attempted to crush the burgeoning uprising. The government's violent response, far from quelling the protests, only served to further inflame them. As the death toll mounted, the demands of the protesters shifted from calls for reform to outright calls for the downfall of the Assad regime. What began as peaceful demonstrations transformed into an armed rebellion as some Syrians, disillusioned with the prospect of peaceful change, took up arms against the government. The country descended into a spiral of violence. The Syrian army defected, forming the Free Syrian Army, FSA, and various other armed groups emerged, each with their own agendas and allegiances. Syria, once a relatively stable country, was now on the brink of a full-blown civil war. As the conflict intensified, the Syrian government increasingly relied on its air power, indiscriminately bombing civilian areas held by rebel groups. Barrel bombs, crude but deadly improvised explosive devices, became a grim hallmark of the regime's brutality. Hospitals, schools, and markets were targeted, terrorizing the civilian population and forcing millions to flee their homes. The conflict in Syria, once a localized uprising, was about to become a complex geopolitical quagmire. As the Syrian government's crackdown intensified, the opposition, initially united in its opposition to Assad, began to fragment. A multitude of armed groups emerged, each with its own ideology, objectives, and territorial control. This fragmentation of the opposition would have profound consequences for the trajectory of the conflict. The Free Syrian Army, FSA, composed largely of defectors from the Syrian army, initially emerged as the dominant rebel group. Backed by Western powers and Gulf states, the FSA espoused a secular, democratic vision for Syria. However, the FSA was plagued by internal divisions, lack of a clear command structure, and shifting allegiances, which hampered its effectiveness. As the conflict dragged on, Islamist groups, often better funded and armed, gained prominence. Groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda affiliate, exploited the chaos to establish themselves as powerful players. These groups, with their strict interpretation of Islam, presented a starkly different vision for Syria's future, further complicating the conflict. The rise of these Islamist groups would have profound implications, not only for Syria but for the wider region. Section 5. International actors, a complex web of alliances and agendas. The Syrian conflict, while rooted in internal grievances, quickly morphed into a proxy war, with regional and international powers backing different sides of the conflict. This influx of arms, funding, and fighters transformed the conflict into a complex geopolitical chessboard, further fueling the violence and complicating any prospects for a peaceful resolution. Russia, a longtime ally of the Assad regime, emerged as a key backer of the Syrian government. Motivated by a desire to preserve its strategic interests in the region and counter Western influence, Russia provided crucial military support to Assad, including airstrikes, ground troops, and military advisors. Iran, another staunch ally of Assad, also provided significant military and financial support, deploying its own troops and backing Shia militias fighting alongside the Syrian army. On the other side of the conflict, the United States, along with its Western and regional allies, provided support to various rebel groups opposed to Assad. However, this support was often inconsistent and hampered by a reluctance to become deeply involved in another Middle Eastern conflict. The U.S., wary of arming extremist groups, provided limited military assistance, focusing instead on humanitarian aid and diplomatic efforts. This hesitancy on the part of Western powers created a vacuum that other actors with their own agendas were quick to fill. Section 6. The Shadow of ISIS. A new threat emerges. In the chaos of Syria, ISIS emerged, seizing territory in Syria and Iraq. Known for brutality and propaganda, ISIS became a dominant force. The US-led coalition and Russia launched airstrikes against ISIS. The intervention weakened other rebel groups, shifting power to Assad. Section 7. Aleppo, a city torn apart. The Syrian city of Aleppo, once a bustling economic hub and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, became a tragic symbol of the conflict's brutality. Divided between government forces in the west and rebel groups in the east, Aleppo witnessed some of the most intense fighting and devastating bombardments of the war. For years, eastern Aleppo, besieged by government forces, endured relentless airstrikes, artillery shelling, and ground offensives. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas were reduced to rubble as the Assad regime, backed by Russian air power, sought to retake the city at any cost. Civilians, trapped in the crossfire, faced unimaginable suffering. The siege of eastern Aleppo, with its heart-wrenching images of starving children and bombed-out hospitals, sparked international outrage but little concrete action to stop the bloodshed. The city's fall to government forces in December 2016 marked a turning point in the war, solidifying Assad's control over Syria's major urban centers and dealing a severe blow to the armed opposition. The battle for Aleppo, while militarily significant, came at a horrific human cost. Section 8. A humanitarian catastrophe, displacement, suffering, and resilience. The Syrian conflict has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history, leaving an indelible scar on the country and its people. Millions have been displaced, both internally and beyond Syria's borders, seeking refuge from the violence and destruction. The Syrian people have endured unimaginable suffering throughout this protracted conflict. Hundreds of thousands have been killed, countless more injured, and millions displaced from their homes. The physical and psychological toll on the civilian population has been immeasurable. The conflict has had a devastating impact on Syria's infrastructure, economy, and social fabric. Despite the horrors they have faced, the Syrian people have shown remarkable resilience. In the face of unimaginable adversity, they have displayed extraordinary courage, compassion, and a determination to rebuild their lives. From inside Syria, where they risked their lives to deliver aid and provide education, to neighboring countries and beyond, Syrians have demonstrated their resilience and their commitment to a better future. Their stories are a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the darkest of times. Section 9. The Long Road Ahead, Seeking Peace in a Shattered Land. As of December 2024, the Syrian conflict, while significantly diminished in intensity, is far from over. The Assad regime, with the backing of its allies, has regained control over much of the country. But pockets of resistance remain. Millions remain displaced, both within Syria and as refugees in neighboring countries, and the humanitarian crisis continues unabated. Finding a lasting and sustainable peace in Syria remains a daunting challenge. The conflict has left the country deeply divided, its social fabric shattered, and its economy in ruins. The international community, often at odds over how to address the conflict, has been unable to forge a unified response. Reconciliation, justice, and accountability for the crimes committed during the war remain elusive goals. The road ahead for Syria is long and uncertain. Rebuilding the country, healing the wounds of war, and achieving a just and lasting peace will require the collective efforts of the Syrian people, regional actors, and the international community. The Syrian conflict stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the urgent need for peaceful solutions to complex global challenges.